after I went bankrupt. My friends who had been with me for many years severed ties with me. My cousin's family went to the ancestral land behind the village that same night, dug up my parents' remains, and threw them by the roadside. My business partners whom I had worked with for years tossed $200 at my feet when I asked for a loan. My girlfriend of 8 years also left me, turning her back on me and into someone else's arms. To humiliate me, she invited me to her wedding with her lover. At the ceremony, she stood before many guests and took the microphone. "Alexander, I'm pregnant. Unfortunately, the child in my womb isn't yours, it's Nathaniel's." The atmosphere was dead silent. As countless eyes turned toward me, I stood up, smiled faintly, and said, "I know. This is what I want. I want the whole world to abandon me." Chapter 1. On the day my friend's business failed, he was crushed by the 10-year crisis. But it wasn't until that night, at a barbecue stall, that he cried like a mess. He cursed the damn world, while I comforted him, telling him that, in the end, there are more people in this world who are kind and loyal. The next day, I went bankrupt. That night, when the news spread, I received a call from my childhood friend. My parents' remains had been dug up by my cousin's family. Furious, I drove back to my hometown that same night with my girlfriend of 8 years. In the Johnson family's ancestral land, my cousin's family had dug up my parents' coffins and tossed them aside. I was trembling with rage, pointing at my cousin and cursing at him. "What are you doing?" Over the years, my cousin had made a fortune through my company, even when he embezzled company funds to buy a house and car for his wife. I turned a blind eye. Now, I see him and his wife standing beside my parents' remains, smirking at me. My cousin coldly sneered, "Alexander, this is my family's ancestral land. I'll bury whoever I want here." I smiled bitterly. "You're just taking advantage of my bankruptcy, aren't you? You've got no money, so you're kicking me while I'm down." My girlfriend, Isabella, stood by silently, her eyes full of complicated emotions. My cousin's wife mocked, "Alexander, don't think we don't know about your bankruptcy. I heard you owe the bank more than $2 billion. Better you die alone than us, having to bury you along with your parents." I stared at them in disbelief. I never imagined that the first to repay my kindness with hatred would be my cousin's family, people I considered close. With my eyes bloodshot, I shouted, "If anyone dares to touch my parents' remains tonight, I'll fight to the death." My cousin's parents came forward with hose and beat me until my head was bloody. In a fit of rage, my cousin raised a curved knife and hacked at my parents' coffins. Outnumbered and outmatched, I was beaten senseless by my cousin's family, drenched in blood. That night, I knocked on the door of my childhood friend's house, hoping they would find a place to bury my parents. But after hearing about my bankruptcy, they were silent, cold in their attitude. I dragged my battered body from door to door throughout the village, only to be rejected every time. Finally, it was Tom, who had had a past dispute with my family, who, seeing my plight, took pity on me. Together, with help from others, we managed to carry my parents back to his ancestral land and hurriedly buried them. That night, I sat in the car, a deep pain gnawing at my heart, as if my insides were being torn apart. My girlfriend, 3 months pregnant, offered no words of comfort. After a long silence, she asked me in a complicated tone, "Alexander, did you go bankrupt?" I didn't hide the truth from Isabella and told her about my bankruptcy. "It will get better," I said. Chapter 2. I was terrified that Isabella would leave me. Trembling, I grabbed her hand. "Isabella, I'll borrow money. I'll make a comeback. Please don't abandon me." "Okay." With bloodshot eyes, I was humbled to the extreme. Isabella pulled her hand away and coldly said, "I'm tired. Call me when you're in the city." Along the way, I forced myself to joke, trying to cheer Isabella up despite the pain in my body. In response, I was met with Isabella's harsh words. "Alexander, are you ever not annoying? I just want to sleep." Do you know that you sound like a nagging old woman? And by the way, your jokes aren't funny at all. I stopped the car, held her hand, and repeatedly apologized. I'm sorry, Isabella. I'm afraid that after I went bankrupt, you'll leave me. Please don't be angry. Okay. I'm really scared. I have nothing left now. If you leave me too, I won't be able to handle it. My pleas received no response. From beginning to end, I was beaten senseless by my cousin's family. Yet Isabella never said a single comforting word. When we returned to the city in the early morning, Isabella, with a cold expression, opened the car door and walked off in her high heels. Turning to leave, just as she was about to reach the door, she looked back at me. Alexander, tonight, you really lost your dignity. I hadn't slept for an entire day and night. I called every friend I knew. But after hearing about my bankruptcy, all the friends who had once been inseparable from me, who had looked up to me, changed their attitudes completely. I sadly realized that in the whole day, I hadn't been able to borrow a single cent. In a last-ditch attempt, I went to a bar where a business partner often took care of me. When he saw me, he sarcastically said, "Oh, isn't this Mr. Johnson, our chairman? What wind blew you here?" Faced with the laughter of those around us, I was embarrassed to the point of wanting to disappear. My business partner, Samuel, sneered, "Mr. Johnson, you came here tonight, looking for a loan." I nodded slightly, not daring to meet his eyes. Samuel opened 2 bottles of whiskey and said, "If you can drink these 2 bottles in one go, I might consider lending you some money." Without hesitation, I downed both bottles. In the end, Samuel burst into laughter, took out $200 from his wallet, and threw it contemptuously at my feet. "Mr. Johnson, no need to borrow money. These $200 are for you. Don't starve to death." I bit my lip, gazed at the $200 on the ground, and walked away, lost and broken. Samuel had once been a small business owner. To please me, he had once drunk himself into the hospital for a stomach wash. I had always taken good care of him, even going as far as spending my own money to help him save his company's business. We even called each other brothers. Looking back at that night, my words of comfort to him seem laughable. All my friends had left me, avoiding me like the plague. I sold my house and car and now wandered the streets, homeless. After drinking the 2 bottles of whiskey, I collapsed by a flower bed. Finally, I managed to call my girlfriend. "Isabella, Isabella, I have nowhere to go. Can I sleep at your place for a couple of nights?" On the other end of the line, there was a long silence. Just as I was about to break under the tension, Isabella coldly spoke. "Alexander, let's break up. Being with you, I'm really exhausted. You can't give me the life I want." Before I could say anything, she hung up the phone. I immediately rushed to Isabella's house. At the sight of my desperate pleas, Isabella impatiently opened the door and walked out. When I saw her, I dropped to my knees without any dignity left, my voice trembling as I cried, "Isabella, please, don't leave me. I have nothing without you. I love you. I really love you so much. I swear I will pull through. Just give me a few years, and I'll give you the life you want." I held onto Isabella's legs. With no pride left as a man, I was as humble as dirt, crying uncontrollably. Chapter 3. In just a few days, half of the hair on my head turned gray. "Isabella, all these years, I bought you bags worth over 100,000, watches worth tens of thousands, sports cars, and villas. I know you still keep those things. If you sell those bags and watches, can you lend the money to me? 8 years. A whole 8 years. Everyone around me treats me like this. I can endure, but you can't. I gave you everything." Isabella disdainfully shook off my hand. She stood high, her arms crossed over her chest, looking down at me. "Alexander, those things were gifts from you, willingly given. They're my possessions. Why should I sell them all to gamble on an uncertain future for you? I wasted my 8 years of youth on you. Please, let me go. Okay. The arguing outside drew Isabella's parents in. Along with her parents, I saw a man. His name was Nathaniel, Isabella's first love. The moment I saw Nathaniel, felt like a lightning strike. My body froze. Johnson, my daughter has already broken up with you. If you dare to harass Isabella again, I'll break your legs. Right now, you're worse than a dog. He, who had once been polite and smiled at me, now held a kitchen knife in his hand and cursed angrily. Panicked, I stammered, "Sir, even the villa you're living in right now was bought by me. Are you telling me that now you won't even pull me up from this situation?" Isabella's father coldly snorted. "The property deed is in my daughter's name. If you think we're going to sell the house, you're dreaming." Isabella's mother wielded a broom and kept hitting me. Nathaniel watched with a gleeful expression. His family had some money. His parents ran a business, and they drove a Mercedes SUV. Tonight, he looked at me and sneered. "Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, in 2 weeks, I'm marrying Isabella." At that moment, I realized Isabella had been secretly in contact with Nathaniel all along. Isabella, indifferent to my pleading, watched coldly, full of disgust. "Alexander, tonight, you're like a dog. Thank God my daughter left you." Isabella's father showed me no mercy. In front of everyone, he belittled me to the point where I felt like nothing. I trembled all over, feeling as though the world had abandoned me. Alone, kneeling in place. 8 years. I spent nearly 10 million on all of you. I almost handed my life over to Isabella. So what if it's money? Even without it, life goes on. Isabella slapped me hard across the face. She yelled sharply, "Alexander, can you stop embarrassing me? I don't love you anymore. The life I want, Nathaniel can give me. You can't. You can't even afford a meal now. Do you want me to support you for the rest of your life?" In the end, Isabella's parents kicked me out from her doorstep. I had only 50 USD left in my pocket. I tried calling every contact in my phone. To my sorrow, not even 500 USD could anyone lend me. In the following days, all the office equipment from my company was taken away. The collection calls never stopped. Not for a second. As Nathaniel had said, 2 weeks later, he married Isabella. To humiliate me, Nathaniel specifically prepared an invitation and sent me a photo of it. The wedding cost his family over 2 million USD. Not giving up, I went to the hotel where the wedding reception was held. I loved Isabella. Even now, I clung to that last shred of hope. As soon as I entered the banquet hall, countless eyes turned to me. Isn't that the bankrupt Mr. Johnson, who gave him the courage to show up today, watching his girlfriend of 8 years marry another man? That's just too interesting. The whispers around me drowned me out. Like a storm. Chapter 4. I ignored the crowd and walked straight up to the stage. Amidst the clamor, I grabbed Isabella's hand. "Isabella, come with me." To my surprise, Isabella forcefully pulled her hand away from mine, and in front of all the guests, she slapped me across the face. She mocked me. "Alexander, who do you think you are? A penniless man like you is worse than a dog. With you, how dare you try to ruin someone else's wedding?" Laughter erupted from the crowd below the stage. Someone deliberately raised their voice, saying, "Mr. Johnson, stop embarrassing yourself. Do you even know your place? How dare you come here to steal someone's bride?" Isabella's father and mother rushed onto the stage, punching and kicking me. Her mother sneered, "Alexander, have you looked at yourself in the mirror?" At that moment, Isabella looked at me with a hint of mockery and said, "I forgot to tell you, Alexander, I'm pregnant. But the baby isn't yours. It's Nathaniel's." Hearing those words, my mind went blank. I staggered backward and almost collapsed to the ground. Then I slowly closed my eyes. In the eyes of those watching, I opened my eyes again and smiled bitterly. When I had money, the whole world revolved around me. But now that I'm broke, I'm as low as a dog in your eyes. My cousin's family dug up my parents' bodies. All my friends distanced themselves from me. Even my girlfriend of 8 years didn't hesitate to betray me. The crowd watched in silence. As I spoke, tears uncontrollably streamed from the corners of my eyes. In that moment, my heart felt like ashes. Get off the stage, Johnson. All you've done is cling to my daughter. Just because you want money, right? Isabella's mother opened her wallet and threw $1,000 at me with force. I didn't look at the cash scattered on the ground. Instead, I looked at Isabella and asked, "So, was our love really built on money?" Isabella gave me a mocking smile. "Do you even have a penny left?" I laughed bitterly and scanned the crowd. Finally, I softly spoke. "Isabella, actually, I haven't gone bankrupt." Isabella didn't react at all. Instead, the mocking smile on her face grew wider. "Alexander, didn't you just want to use this excuse to win me back? You've had your company emptied out. You sold your cars and house. What face do you have left to stand here and talk? What are you waiting for? Hurry up and get out." Isabella started calling security. The crowd below began gossiping as well. I think Alexander couldn't handle the shock and went mad. Doesn't he know what he looks like? Trying to steal someone's bride like this. Chapter 5. Before I could leave the wedding reception, I saw my cousin's family rushing over, looking tired and dusty. As soon as they saw me, my cousin's wife screamed, "See, I knew it. Isabella is getting married today. And I knew Alexander would be here." My cousin strode toward me. He grabbed my collar roughly and growled, "Johnson, don't think that just because your company went bankrupt, everything is over. I still own 5% of the company's shares. At the company's peak, that was worth over 20 million. Hand it over." Under the gaze of the crowd, I calmly looked at my cousin and said, "When I started from nothing, your family was deep in debt from your gambling. More than 2 million. I used my own money to pay off your gambling debts. Your parents came to me with you, kneeling outside my company, begging me to give you a job and a chance. The 5% of shares you have were also given to you by me. You've embezzled company funds, lived recklessly, and bought your wife a house and car. The holes you dug, I paid to fill." At this point, I turned to look at Isabella's family. My voice grew louder. "For 8 years, I bought you bags, watches, luxury cars, and villas. And what did I get in return?" My cousin's mother sneered. "That was your choice, wasn't it? Alexander, you're just an idiot. You've got no one to blame but yourself." My cousin punched me in the face, knocking me to the ground. His broad frame pressed down on me, his foot firmly on my face, while his parents held down my arms and legs. My cousin wouldn't relent, shouting, "Alexander, my 5% stake is worth 20 million. Not a penny less. Don't think I don't know where you buried your parents. If you don't hand over the money, I'll go back to the village and dig up your parents' bones. Feed them to the dogs." My cousin's parents laughed, their amusement cruel. Isabella, arms crossed, looked at me with an air of satisfaction. My cousin's mother then said, "How about we just strip him of everything he's worth and sell it to pay the debt? Debt should be paid. It's only right." I struggled wildly, but it was useless. My cousin's foot remained firmly planted on my face. Nathaniel laughed. "Even if you beat him to death, he still won't have a penny to his name." My cousin said, "It's fine if he can't pay up. Alexander, don't forget how you used to boss me around back then. If you crawl through my legs in front of everyone today, I'll let you go." At that moment, I finally broke free. My mind was a blank, and I threw a punch at my cousin's face. But before I could land the second punch, my cousin knocked me to the ground, blood pouring from my head. His strike was brutal. I curled up on the ground, clutching my head. Soon, my cousin's wife and his parents joined in. and within minutes, I was lying in a pool of blood, on the brink of death. Isabella simply coldly said, "Drag him out. Don't dirty up my wedding reception." I was thrown into a car and dumped in front of the hospital. Nurses rushed to carry me inside, my face mangled and nearly disfigured. I stayed in the hospital for several days. During my stay, I saw photos of Isabella and Nathaniel's honeymoon on social media. In the photos, Isabella looked sweet and happy, leaning against Nathaniel's chest. On her wrist was the watch I had bought for her, worth hundreds of thousands. Throughout my hospital stay, not a single person came to visit me. Chapter 6. A week later, I finally managed to leave the hospital. The opening ceremony for Moon Group was about to begin. Ignoring my still healing injuries, I dressed in a suit, hailed a taxi, and headed over early. As soon as I arrived at the entrance, I saw 5 brand new Bentleys parked outside. To my surprise, I ran into Isabella's family and many of my former business partners. Even my cousin's family had entered the venue with the business owners they'd gotten to know over the years. Inside the dazzling venue, the place was already packed. When Isabella saw me, her face first showed confusion, then quickly turned into a disdainful sneer. "Alexander, what are you doing here?" Nathaniel, my cousin, and his parents turned around at the sound of her voice. I spread my arms and smiled. "I'm here for the opening ceremony of Moon Group." For some reason, I didn't feel angry at Isabella anymore. When I looked at her, I wasn't furious or heartbroken. I felt nothing. Nathaniel shook his head and laughed. "Alexander, you know today is Moon Group's opening ceremony. Do you really think you're still the old Johnson, the CEO? If you knew it was Moon Group, then you should know this isn't the kind of place a beggar like you should be at." My cousin's mother spoke up. "I think this Johnson guy is so broke. He can't even afford a meal. Who knows where he heard the news and came here to scam food and drinks." As she spoke, she raised her voice, shouting, "Attention, all the bosses." Her words instantly drew the attention of everyone in the room. The crowd at Moon Group's opening ceremony turned to look at me. My cousin's mother pointed at me with a sneer. "Be careful of this beggar. His name is Alexander. His company has gone bankrupt, and he's so poor he can barely eat. He snuck in here to steal food. Keep an eye on your valuables. Don't let this beggar take them while you're distracted." With that, my cousin's family also turned their attention to me. At that moment, I felt like the center of attention. My cousin walked toward me and laughed. "Alexander, I didn't expect you to be so tough, managing to get out of the hospital after just over a week. You didn't sneak in here to steal something, did you?" The commotion caught the attention of the hostess. She came over to me and asked to check my invitation. I shook my head. "I don't need an invitation to be here." Isabella, who had been watching the scene unfold, couldn't hold herself back any longer. She looked at me and mocked. "Alexander, in a place like this, you don't even count as a fart. Who do you think you are? The boss of Moon Group? And you say you don't need an invitation?" Amid the laughter and mockery from the crowd, I casually nodded and gave a smile. "You're right. I am the boss of Moon Group." Isabella rolled her eyes. "Alexander, I think you've really lost it. Good thing I broke up with you back then." My cousin laughed loudly. "Johnson, if you're the boss here, then I must be Jesus. Don't put a pig's nose through a leak, pretending to be an elephant." I ignored their insults. I wasn't bothered by them anymore. They could do whatever they wanted. But one day, I would get back at them tenfold, or even 100-fold. I reached out and, under my cousin's astonished gaze, slapped him across the face. "Diego, you'll regret this soon enough." My cousin's wife sneered. "Johnson, I think you should leave now. You're not in a place where you can act up like this. Moon Group is a key focus of the city, and if anything goes wrong, you won't be able to handle the consequences. Where are the security guards? Get this beggar out of here." The room fell silent. Even my former business partners wore strange smiles. Before anyone could say anything else, a woman in a sexy outfit took the microphone and walked up to the stage. Everyone knew the opening ceremony of Moon Group was about to start. I found a seat and sat down casually. The woman on stage talked about the future, development and grand vision of Moon Group. She spoke quickly and efficiently, then addressed the crowd. Next, let's invite our Moon Group's chairman to give a speech. At that moment, I slowly stood up and walked toward the stage. Chapter 7. As I walked past Isabella, she froze for a moment and said, "Alexander, the chairman of Moon Group is called that. Not you." On the other side, my cousin's family and several of my former business partners all looked at me. I ignored them, turned to Isabella, and smiled, saying, "I told you, I am the chairman of Moon Group. Don't you know that Moon Group is a restructured company, which means we broke up the old group, integrated resources, and created something much larger. But with someone like you, who only cares about money, you wouldn't understand." As I walked toward the stage, several senior company executives, who were seated closest to the podium, stood up one by one. They nodded and greeted me. "Chairman Johnson, Chairman Johnson." The number of people standing and acknowledging me increased. Step by step, I walked onto the stage and took the microphone from my secretary. I didn't offer any polite pleasantries. Instead, I looked down at Isabella's family and my cousin's family, their faces pale. "Today, during the opening ceremony of Moon Group, I have a few announcements to make. First, as the chairman of Moon Group, I am announcing that from now on, we will be suspending all business collaborations with former clients. Second, I will unite with some like-minded friends to target Nathaniel's family business. Third, the entire legal department of Moon Group will do everything in its power to sue Diego for embezzlement and illegal appropriation of company funds at his previous company. Fourth, I will recover every cent I spent over the past 8 years on my ex-girlfriend." With every word I spoke, Isabella's face grew paler. As for my cousin, he was already slumped to the ground, his face ashen. I stood on the stage, smiling at my cousin. The amount of embezzled funds he stole was enough to put him in prison for life. Although I had personally covered those debts, I had kept all the evidence of his embezzlement close to me. After making these statements, I looked back at Isabella. I've never gone bankrupt. In fact, my business is expanding more and more, and I've built it into a large group. I handed the microphone back to the senior executives and turned to leave the stage. Before I could reach the elevator, Isabella and my cousin's family rushed over to me. Isabella, emotional, grabbed my arm. She spoke frantically. "Alexander, if you weren't bankrupt, why did you lie to me?" I shrugged and smiled. "When did I ever say I went bankrupt? The company simply restructured and needed a larger space. You mistook it for bankruptcy. Since you think I'm bankrupt, I just went along with your idea and pretended to be bankrupt. If I hadn't, would I have been able to see your true colors?" Isabella panicked. She gripped my hand tightly. "I'm sorry, Alexander. I didn't mean to. It's my parents. After they found out you were bankrupt, they kept pressuring me to break up with you." She turned to shout at my cousin's parents. "It's all your fault. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have broken up with Alexander." In a fit of anger, Isabella pushed her mother-in-law to the ground. "You two old fools. Why did you force me to marry Nathaniel? It's all your fault." Isabella hurriedly knelt in front of me. "Alexander, please, forgive me. Give me another chance. Please. If it weren't for my parents, I would never have broken up with you." I kicked Isabella away, coldly speaking to her. "Isabella, have I ever given you a chance? Do you know, that night, when I kneeled in front of you and begged you not to leave, I was giving myself one last bit of hope. Isabella, we'll see each other in court." Everything your family has spent of mine over these years. I'll take back every single cent. My cousin and his wife were blocking the elevator doors. My cousin was already pale with fear. Chapter 8. My cousin's wife and his parents pulled at my arms, pleading for me not to call the police. I slapped my cousin's wife across the face and coldly said, "I've already been more than generous to your family. I can let anyone off, but not your family." It seemed like something clicked in my cousin's wife's mind. She quickly said, "Alexander, don't forget, my husband still has 5% of the shares in your company." I smiled and responded, 5% of the shares were in the old company. What does that have to do with the current Moon Group? Besides, haven't you even looked at the contract? There's a clause that says the shares were given to you for free, but if I ever change my mind, I can buy them back for $1 at any time. You can't refuse. You fools didn't read it carefully. You heard that I was giving you shares, and you eagerly signed your names without thinking. My cousin's family was utterly hopeless now. My cousin's parents began cursing at me. "Alexander, Diego is your cousin. We're family." I laughed in anger. I pointed at these two old people and yelled, "Family. When I went bankrupt that night, you dug up my parents' bones from Johnson family's ancestral land. You 5 beat me until my head was bloody. And at Isabella's wedding, you tortured me to the brink of death. Did you treat me like family then?" I crouched down on the floor and slapped my cousin's face. I said to him, "Diego, with the more than 10 million you embezzled, you'll be doing hard labor in prison for many years. Trash. Even if I lose everything, I'll make sure your whole family never finds peace." I tried to leave, but Isabella grabbed onto my foot. "Alexander, I was wrong. I know I was wrong." Isabella was crying uncontrollably. "I'll go get an abortion and divorce Nathaniel. If you're willing to forgive me, I can sever ties with my parents right now." I smiled at her. "Isabella, you're just a woman who lifts others up only to step on them. Now that you've come crawling back to me, I don't even want to look at you. I can't even imagine a woman more worthless than you. Get ready to sell your house and car." I kicked Isabella off and turned to enter the elevator. No sooner had I left, the police arrived and took my cousin Diego away. As for the house and car, I did sell them. I wanted to buy a bigger villa and upgrade to a more luxurious car brand. Chapter 9. After the bankruptcy, I saw human nature for what it truly was. In front of a Bentley, I saw my friend, the one who had failed in a business investment with me. He looked at my nearly gray hair and smiled. "Looks like you've been through more than I have these days. Alexander, did I win the bet?" I nodded slightly. "You won." My friend sighed. "Our bet has turned out to be meaningless." I shook my head and denied it. "No, to me, it was very meaningful. You showed me human nature. I only came up with this idea on a whim while the company was restructuring, but I ended up losing terribly. If it weren't for the impromptu bet between me and him, I wouldn't have pretended to go bankrupt. I wouldn't have seen people's true colors. They had been lurking around me, shamelessly draining me dry. The next day, my cousin's wife and his parents found my newly bought villa. They knelt at the door, begging me to let Diego off the hook. They looked remorseful, crying and pleading. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window on the second floor, watching with interest. When I no longer had any use for you, you didn't even have the right to see me. My heart had become colder, more merciless. After enough of watching my cousin's family's miserable state, I called the property management and had them send security to escort these pests out of the villa community. The legal department in my company was efficient. Almost the day after my cousin was arrested, they presented all the evidence of his embezzlement. Because the evidence was complete, the collection process was skipped. After being detained for 5 or 6 days, my cousin was handed over to the court for prosecution. Diego had embezzled 12 million. a large amount with serious consequences. He was sentenced to 12 years with no chance of appeal, and all his illegal earnings were to be recovered. If he couldn't pay it back, he'd have to sell his house and cars. The situation unfolded too quickly for my cousin to transfer any assets. All the cash and real estate under his name were seized by the court. As for Isabella's family, in an effort to win me back, Isabella severed ties with her parents. Her parents didn't show up, but Isabella sat at the entrance of my new villa every day. No matter how many times I tried to drive her away, she remained unmoved. I blocked her number and deleted her on WeChat. She kept shouting in front of my villa, "Alexander, I was wrong. I shouldn't have listened to my parents and broken up with you. We've been together for 8 years. Can you really just abandon me?" I couldn't take it anymore and opened the villa door. Isabella immediately rushed forward, trying to push the door open to enter the villa. But I stopped her with my hand. "Isabella, how did I never realize how thick your skin is? What status do you have to think you deserve to step foot in this villa?" Isabella grabbed my hand. She refused to let go. "Alexander, give me a chance to make things right," she begged. "I will compensate you double. I've had an abortion, and I've severed ties with my parents. If you don't want me, I'll be homeless. Do you really have the heart to let me freeze to death on the street?" I forcefully shook her off and coldly sneered. "Your life or death has nothing to do with me. Isabella, you really are a two-faced slave. Right now, you don't even deserve to stand in front of me and say a word. Diego's already been sent to prison. Now it's your turn." Isabella's face turned pale with despair. I dialed the police, reporting that a woman with ill intentions had been loitering in front of my house every day. I suspected she was casing the place, waiting for an opportunity to rob me. Isabella was taken away by the police. Her prosecution proceeded as planned. Every large sum of money I had transferred to Isabella, the bags, the watches, were all given with the intent of marriage. Even though there was no written agreement, the court would support it. Took me several days to organize all the gifts I had given Isabella over the past 8 years. The total came to more than 30 million, including the villa where she now lived, which I had bought for 15 million. The 4 or 5 luxury cars under her name were worth over 10 million, over 30 million, and not once did Isabella contribute a penny when I pretended to go bankrupt. Despite this, she still had the audacity to kneel in front of her house and beg. The court quickly scheduled a trial for Isabella. As the plaintiff, I presented all the records of the large transfers to Isabella, invoices for luxury items like bags, watches, cars, and the villa. It was a thick stack of evidence. Isabella tried to resist, but with the overwhelming evidence, the trial didn't take long, and the verdict was handed down. She lost the case. She was ordered to pay back over 30 million. In the courtroom, Isabella collapsed. Even though she had severed ties with her parents, now, their villa would be repossessed and auctioned off. Years ago, Isabella's family sold their old house to move into the villa, but now they had squandered the money. In other words, Isabella's parents would have nowhere to go. With over 30 million in debt, they couldn't even afford to rent a house. I ignored their pleas as I walked out of the courtroom. That night, I had been confident in front of my friend, believing that no one would ever abandon me. Now, as I look back on the past month, all the experiences have boiled down to 2 words: human nature. After pretending to go bankrupt, I left chaos in my wake. All those who had kicked me when I was down didn't escape. Everything they had taken from me would be paid back tenfold. This revenge was far from over. It had just begun.